Hey everyone, welcome to the wonderful world of Remnant Radio. My name is Joshua Lewis, and today we are talking about the book of Enoch with Dr. Michael Heiser, who's on the other line with us. Before we introduce him and his ministry, I want to let you know a little bit about who we are and what we do here on the channel. We're a theology broadcast. We interview pastors, teachers, theologians, historians, and the whole goal is to study theology, get outside of our echo chamber, and learn from Christian brothers and sisters that are within the Orthodox Christian faith, but maybe from a different denominational stream than you are familiar with. If you're interested in something like that, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we're coming out with content just like this. Michael is on a writing sabbatical, but since we've been honored to be with Dr. Heiser, Michael decided to come off of sabbatical from today and I guess, Skype in from the ranch, Michael? How you doing over there, bro?
Yes, I am Skyping in from a cabin in the hill country of Texas, and I've been on my writing retreat, writing a book about the book of Revelation. It has been crazy exciting and crazy hard. Hardest thing I've ever done, probably, in terms of just professional stuff. But anyway, man, it's been really rewarding working through it. I have 5 weeks off, so I have in total, so that puts me at 2 weeks remaining, a little bit less than. And when I heard that Dr. Heiser was going to be on the show, I just thought I would Skype in because I didn't want to miss this one. And as it turns out, Dr. Heiser, the book of Enoch informs the book of Revelation in a number of places, so it'll be quite relevant. But we're really excited to have you on the show, Dr. Heiser. I want to give you just a moment to introduce yourself for those who don't know you. But before you do, I also just want to invite you guys, if you've benefited from our ministry in any way, I'd love for you to consider donating on Patreon. You can give as little as $5 a month and help support the ministry that we're doing. And we also put out videos, and so we try to show a little love to our Patreon community. Also, one more thing is tomorrow we have Francis Chan on the show, and we're just going to really connect with Francis because he's been doing some interesting things and meeting with the Pope and Eastern Orthodox and talking differently about communion, and then he's got his Reformed community over here, and he's got a mega church that he left and missions work and all kinds of crazy stuff. And really the central question is, what's going on, Francis? We're just going to talk and just kind of figure that out. So anyway, but I don't want to waste any more time. I want to talk to you, Dr. Heiser. So Dr. Heiser, could you just introduce us to yourself and your ministry?
Yeah, I'm currently the executive director of the Awakening School of Theology in Jacksonville, Florida, which is brand new. It's less than 2 years old. The short version of that is I left Logos Bible Software. I was there for 14 years. And before that, I taught at a variety of places. I taught online the whole time I was at Logos. And I taught at two universities in the area as well. So, who I am, I'm a professor. I wrote lots of reference content for Logos. I was one of the founders of Mobile Ed. Some people might be familiar with that. Wrote a lot for their magazine. That's sort of what I did. But I came down to Jacksonville because there was this church network down here wanted to create a school that for the first year focused on my content. So we spend 30 weeks going through Unseen Realm, which is probably, the thing that I'm most known for. It's, sold a ton. And then the second year is kind of like anything I care about, which was nice. I mean, that's a nice deal. First year is your stuff.
Just teach stuff.
You care about. Yeah. And so second year, which we're into now, I refer to as postmodern apologetics. So it's all the stuff you sort of find on the internet, and some of which has intersection with academic discussion, academic issues about the Old and New Testament. One semester old, one semester new. But it can be anything from, hey, everything in Genesis comes from Babylonian texts, to, in the New Testament, the synoptic problem, all the way over to the zeitgeist nonsense that Jesus is just a Christian version of dying and rising Mediterranean gods. And so, just stuff that people run into with some regularity. and honestly don't know what to do with it because militant atheism peddles this. The people in what I affectionately call Middle Earth, which is the internet community, they peddle this ancient aliens, weird stuff on the History Channel, and it's rare that a week goes by that I don't get some email, basically somebody struggling with their faith because of something stupid they heard on on one of these venues or read, on Facebook, and rather than just say, dude, if you want a reason to leave the faith, I can do better than this for you, and just say, why would this trouble you at all? Like I can think of just better reasons like personal pain or whatever. But instead of doing something like that, which doesn't have a whole lot of value, it's like, okay, why don't we just go through these sorts of topics? Some of them bizarre, some of them are kind of normal for people who do apologetics, and just help people learn how to think about primary sources, about framing questions, about what questions to ask, about evaluating things you're asked to believe, penetrating past the heated exchange of the internet, and trying to really have a conversation and how that exposes what the claim is and really its basis or lack thereof, so that you can actually do something useful in that conversation. So that's what we're doing. 2 years, we have a certificate program. We're not pursuing any accreditation or anything like that. That was a condition of mine, by the way. In other words, please don't throw hundreds of thousands of dollars into the toilet and hit the flush. Because that's basically what that is. I'd just rather have something geared to the local church and the lay community, because there's more of them than there are people in the guild, and they really matter. So that's what I try to do. I try to take scholarship and make it accessible to the normal person, and give them some payoff. The people who already know that they sense that they're not getting the content that they should. There must be more to the Bible than what I'm getting. That's the sweet spot for me. That I love to tell people your intuition is correct. It's correct. You're that thing that's just nagging you. You're right. And so, we want to challenge you with content and help you again to be a good thinker when it comes to Scripture.
That's great. Where do people follow you on that? Like if they wanted to learn more about your school, how would they follow up with that?
The homepage is drmsh.com. The school's URL is just schooloftheology.com. Registration is not yet open for, let's see, I get my semester calendar mixed up in my head here. For what would be next fall, it's not open yet. It'll open during the summer. But we have about 1,000 students, all overwhelmingly online. I only have 40 or so in the physical class, so it's mostly online. But it'll open in the summer, and so you can go up there now and just check out what we do and find out all the details. But that's where you do that. I have a podcast, nakedbiblepodcast.com. So that's again something that has gotten a good deal of traffic, that people find out about me through the podcast, and of course all the books are on Amazon. But drmsh.com will pretty much get you anywhere.
Great.
Where I'm doing something.
Cool. Well, let's dive into the subject matter for today's show. Can you just introduce us to the Book of Enoch? What is the Book of Enoch? And we're talking about First Enoch. Introduce it to our audience. What is it? Why is it important? And why is it worth Christians having a discussion about a book that's not listed in our canon?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you referred to it as First Enoch, because that's a good thing to know. There are several Enochs, 1, 2, 3 Enoch. First Enoch is the only one that really securely, for the most part, predates the Christian era. So this is a book that comes from what academia would call Second Temple Judaism, the period in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So it's also known as the intertestamental period. And it's important because your listeners might want to sit down, because this is going to be really profound when I say this. You're driving, pull over on the side of the road. I'm about to rock your world here. It's important because New Testament writers read books. They really did. They read books. the people in their community, Jews, looked at the Hebrew Bible as the inspired word of God. And so they wrote lots of stuff about it, asking questions about how to interpret. What do we do with all these data points? How do we connect the dots? What does it mean? And so a lot of people are writing stuff, and the book of Enoch is one of these things. And so this material, broadly speaking, Second Temple Jewish literature, leaks its way into the New Testament in a number of ways. Enoch is probably the most prominent because it got the most discussion in the early church. Now, I don't think First Enoch belongs in the canon. I don't look at it as inspired or canonical. But again, another pro tip: books don't have to be canonical to be important.
Right.
We ought to read the things, the material that biblical writers read, because if we do, we will be able to understand a little bit more of why they dip into that content. What's their goal? What are they using it to do? How are they using it to communicate? In other words, we just become more literate readers of our Bible. But Enoch gets most attention because there were some in the early church that thought it should be in the canon. There's only really one Jewish sect that ever thought that, and we can talk about why most didn't, include it. But that's the context for it. It gets talked about so often.
Uh-huh.
I mean,
Okay,
people
well,
don't really talk about the veil.
yeah, well, let's talk about that. Why wasn't it included in the canon? Why didn't the Jews view it as something that was canonical? Why did a few Christians, but most Christians not? Can you just kind of speak to that story?
Yeah. The general reason why it was not considered canonical is that the Jewish community had this notion that for something to be sacred literature, it not only has to be tied to a historical prophetic figure from the biblical period, but also it needs to be witnessed in Hebrew. Okay, as far as we know, the book of Enoch did not originate in Hebrew. There are no Hebrew fragments of the book at all. There are some Aramaic fragments that were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that's noteworthy because the one community that gave Enoch an elevated status was the sect that lived at Qumran. Most people think they're Essenes, so we can just call them Essenes for the sake of the discussion. But they quote Enoch along with something else that of their own origin, the Temple Scroll. They quote those two things in the same manner that they quote Old Testament books. They quote Scripture. They have the same formulaic expressions. And they also wrote commentaries on all the biblical books plus Enoch and the Temple Scroll. So that tells scholars that these two books had a special elevated status at the same level. But that was unique in Judaism. Most of the Jewish community is like, no, we're not buying it. Show it to us in Hebrew, and then we'll think about it. In the early church, that doesn't really apply because the early church is composed, so much of Gentiles. We have the New Testament written in Greek. This is the Hellenistic period, on into the Greco-Roman period. And so the early church doesn't have this sense of, hey, it needs to be in Hebrew, which of course they don't because nobody could read it. I mean, you can count the number of church fathers that could read Hebrew literally on one hand. So that just flies out the window. And so they just naturally look at it differently. They look at, the content and they can see how the content mirrors, certain things in the New Testament. They have respect for the Jewish community that did consider it important, even if it's not canonical. So, it leaks into the discussion of the canon with a few, early church fathers. But at the end of the day, even its defenders reached the point where they would, they actually said stuff like this, that, hey, I'm the only one still alive here sitting around that thinks this book ought to be in. But it looks like the Holy Spirit has moved to the mass of the church, the mass of the believing community, and so I'm good with that.
Yeah.
I'm just not going to worry about it.
Yeah.
I guess I was wrong, and so they just assumed that the Spirit would show them what to recognize as canonical. It's kind of a nice thought that they just let it drop. And sort of be obedient, to again the leadings of providence. And we today we have a very similar view of the canon. It's about recognition. We assume that the Spirit would help people get it right, and they did too. But that's why it gets more play. It's just it hits closer to home because of a few early church fathers.
Yeah. So in talking about the early church fathers, we've got like Irenaeus and Tertullian and like one or two others that are like real prominent, that if I said their names that our audience would be like, okay, I've heard of those names before. But then, like you said, there's this vast majority of scholarship that says, hey, this is not of the canon of Scripture. And they might even hold it as an important book of history, and explaining some philosophical views of some of the Jewish people at that time, but they wouldn't hold it as canon. Why was it rejected by them as canon? The majority, and not those minority that we mentioned before.
I mean, after the first few centuries, the enthusiasm for it dies out just because of the numbers. Again, people willing to let the mass of the leadership and the believing community, again, assuming they're guided by the Holy Spirit and just letting it go. But I think there's another factor here. You're right that I could show you articles. There's a wonderful article by a guy named Schultz. His last name is Schultz, on Irenaeus's view of sin, and it's Enochian through and through. And he quotes Enoch in it. This is, he has the sin of the watchers in there. It's not just the fall, and we've got more than one rebellion going on. It's just, it's classic Enochian stuff. But, he's not going to live forever. And so even though people might have thought those thoughts, and they're going to read somebody like Irenaeus, who is tracing the idea from Enoch into the New Testament, that's what's going to give the ideas the weight. But the book, that Irenaeus is using for this, is not going to be so much of a factor. It's rather the ideas that are important. But the opposite side of that coin is really Augustine. Augustine, part of his early story, he belonged to the sect of the Manichees, which he eventually parted ways with and really had some significant theological disagreements. And the Manichees revered the Book of Enoch. So I think, Augustine had a little bit of an axe to grind there too, because of his stature, that carries weight, in the believing community. So it just fell out of disuse, and as time goes on, there's less and less of a concern for, hey, are we reading our New Testament in light of what Jews in the intertestamental period, after all, this is their Bible. It moves from that to, what do the church councils say? It moves to medieval people. And I don't. That's not to say there's anything sinister there. It's just the later stuff, the stuff that's divorced from the closer context, becomes prominent because people have to write. The leadership of the church has to write and address specific questions in their own day. And they become the focus points of theological discussion. It's not this other stuff now, it's this. And so it's kind of a normal process and a normal transition. But, we're more sensitive today, just generally as academics, to reading Scripture in its original context, which is not the church fathers. It's not the medieval, Roman Catholic writers or whatever. It's nothing post-biblical. We're more sensitive to that today because we have access to so much of the material.
Yeah.
And they didn't, and so we naturally gravitate toward primary sources. And so that gets a lot of the focus of attention if you're in a grad program in biblical studies. You're taught to do what you do in primary texts. And, hopefully people going through that don't develop a complete disregard for the church fathers or philosophical theology, because it's all important. They're taking here's what should happen. And I think, a lot of cases does, but in some cases obviously doesn't. Systematic theologians, philosophical theologians, historical theologians, these kinds of scholars should be taking the nuggets of Scripture. They should be benefiting from the exegesis of the nuts and bolts Greek and Hebrew guys, and then understanding text in its own context, and then moving out to here's the data pool. We have this question now that isn't specifically addressed. And so how do we use those data points to address this? Things like AI, okay? Obviously there's no verse that talks about AI, in the Bible, but it's a significant issue. So we need those kinds of thinkers to take the data and think creatively about it in relation to specific questions that are just going to come up in the progress of history. As life goes on, you have to have those people who can think outside the box and apply, hopefully, the work of exegesis that others do to what they need. You can't do everything. This is supposed to be a team effort here.
Dr. Heiser, earlier you used the word Enochian, and I would guess that probably most of our audience has not personally read the book of Enoch from front to start to finish. And so just help us understand, give us an overview. What is the book of Enoch about?
Yeah, Enoch is an apocalypse, okay? And think of the book of Revelation. What's the book of Revelation about? Well, it's a series of visions that are about the end of the world, really the day of the Lord, when the wicked get judged and the righteous are vindicated. In the New Testament context, the apocalypse naturally focuses on Jesus, his work as the Messiah, but also his status as judge. So you get both sides of that coin. In terms of Enoch, this is pre-Christian, most of the material anyway. And so they don't have Jesus as a touch point, but they do have Messiah figures in these apocalypses. Enoch tells the story of, hey, the end is coming, get ready. The wicked are going to get it. The righteous are going to get vindicated. But then he naturally addresses the obvious question. Well, why is the world coming to an end? Like why all the judgment? And the answer isn't because you've rejected Jesus. Again, this is before Jesus, all right? The answer is because of the proliferation of depravity throughout the whole world and the rejection of the righteousness of God. And Enoch will trace that theme back to, yes, there's a little bit of the fall, just a little bit. Most of the problem with evil, though, for Enoch, first Enoch, is directly traceable to the transgression of the Watchers, which is Enoch's version, retelling of the Genesis 6, 1-4, really 1-5 episode. And, so that he has to give a rationale for why the world is so evil, why humanity got corrupted to the degree that it is. And that helps explain why God has reached the point where he's fed up. With this apocalypse, the end is Enochian material has all these features. Apocalyptic thinking, there's an explanation for the proliferation of depravity, which in turn explains the judgment. There's also lots of heavenly visions because Enoch is transported, to the heavenly throne room of God. He goes through different levels of heaven because he's gonna hear what God is up to, kind of like John does in Revelation. John is privy through certain visionary experiences as to what's going to go on. So again, there's a lot of similarity there, and you get angelic interpreters, angelic guides, lots of these different sort of supernatural characters. Enochian, those are the features of first Enoch. And other texts that have those features, that's a term scholars use. Oh, it's Enochian. It's kind of like Enoch because Enoch's the one that most people are more familiar with. And so that's where the term comes from. It looks like Enoch, smells like Enoch.
So let me.
If it's heavy on Nephilim, it's Enochian.
Let me ask this question of Claire. He said if it's heavy on angels, it's Enochian. But I'm curious about this because you're using the phrase Enoch is the one they're familiar with. Enoch is concerned with this in this writing. I think it can be confusing to maybe our audience who's thinking that maybe actually Enoch wrote this book. Can you explain to us, well, first of all, let me ask it this way: is there modern scholarship that actually believes the person Enoch in the book of Genesis actually wrote first Enoch? And then maybe to explain to us what the pseudo epigraphic, literature is and what that actually means in the context of
Yeah.
that for our audience who's kind of foreign to that.
Yeah, no, there's no evidence that the person Enoch wrote this book. I mean, you'd need a text trail for that. The oldest material we have for the Book of Enoch is 3rd century BC. Some of the Aramaic fragments would be that old, and that is long after the time of the flood. Okay, which is Enoch is preceding that. So what you have here is it's very typical for writings in between the testaments to have writers either name a book after the principal character or name the book after a biblical figure. I guess maybe for less charitable reasons, because it's going to draw attention to their work.
Mm-hmm.
I think most of this, to use a biblical example, Joshua. Well, there isn't a verse in Joshua that says Joshua wrote it. But lo and behold, Joshua's like the main figure. So go figure, we'll call it Joshua. I mean, we don't know who wrote it, but that's the name it gets because that represents the content. Well, in Enoch's case, it's very obvious. Yeah, it's very obvious that Enoch is the central character. He's the one that gets transported to heaven and sees all this stuff. So yeah, what else would you call it? You wouldn't call it Bob. You wouldn't call it
the Book of Bob.
If only.
I don't know that would carry the same credibility.
Right. To be a little less flippant, Moses doesn't even show up. Why would we call it that? So this happens a lot in the intertestamental period, and people are familiar, with the way books sort of get their title by people who have read the stuff. And what's it about? What's that new book about? It's about Enoch. So it becomes known as the Book of Enoch. Mm-hmm. So it's not really anything strange or weird or again sinister. It's just it's sort of a convention of the period that we don't really have that because we're taught to write things and give them specific titles and whatnot. It used to be, if you've ever spent any time on archive.org, look up 1800s, and the title's like 50 words long. Okay, that was the convention for that day, and we don't do that anymore. The convention just changes.
Right. Okay, now, Dr. Heiser, could you talk to us about just the New Testament books that Enoch especially informs? We've got Jude, we've got 2 Peter, I guess maybe even a little bit of 1 Peter, and then Revelation. Just kind of speak into how this informs the New Testament in the most significant ways.
Yeah, I mean, Revelation, of course, really deserves that. You're also there's a whole book out. I think it's about 3 or 4 years old now, edited by Stukenbrook that talks about Enoch in the Gospels. And typically when you have connection points with New Testament books, it's not like the New Testament writer is quoting something word by word, line by line. Mm-hmm. It typically follows the formula of allusions. Now, since you have your head into a Revelation commentary, which is my definition of a descent into madness, by the way.
I'm going mad over here.
Since you do, you probably know all too well that John uses the Old Testament everywhere in the book of Revelation. But if you look at Beale's commentary, and Beale has a monograph on the use of the Old Testament in the book of Revelation, there isn't a single direct quote of the Old Testament in Revelation. Like word for word. Sometimes John is generous and he gives you like 3 out of 6 words. What he usually does is he will allude to things. Even though they will look upon whom they have pierced. John will take a part of that line and do something a little different with it. What John typically does is he assumes that your Old Testament so well. And say, oh, I like these 2 words here. I like this phrase. I like that word over there. I like this. And he'll take 4 or 5 of these things and throw them into the blender. And if you can't figure him out, like where he's getting all the stuff and why he's putting it together, well, that's just too bad. Well, that's your problem. So this is what New Testament writers do with other books. And Enoch is a good example. For instance, the Book of Life. Okay. Believe it, that is not an idea that John invented in the Book of Revelation. It not only has a deep Old Testament history, but it also has a long history in the intertestamental period, including books like Enoch and other books. There are lots of heavenly books. And so this becomes part of the stream because some of the things that John will say about the Book of Life and other books, guess what? You can find that stuff in Enoch. Even if John doesn't give you it, verse by verse, word by word, so that you can, it's this particular verse in Enoch. Doesn't matter. The content there is something very specific. The whole association of the lake of fire being created for the devil and his angels in the Gospels. It's only in one place in Matthew 25. Guess where else we find that?
Enoch.
Yes, that would be correct. That would be. So this is the kind of thing that if you know this literature, you not only know as you read the New Testament, okay, I know where John's getting that, I know where Matthew's getting that, but you also know the fuller set of ideas, what those other books do with that and what the contexts are. And then it really comes down to, okay, is the New Testament writer using that information to help him express a particular idea, or is he tweaking it a little bit? Is he creating a difference that he wants you to see and pick up on?
That's good.
I just got done with, I'm writing what I call a reader's commentary on the Book of Enoch. So I just finished the second volume, and Messiah is one of the prominent features of chapters 37 through 71. It's called the Book of Parables. Enoch is actually like Psalms. It's composed of a number of sub books, and so there in chapters 37 through 71, there's a ton of talk about Messiah. He both uses Old Testament descriptors like anointed one or servant or something like that, but he also has a few of his own that you have to look elsewhere in the literature for what he's doing there and why he's choosing that terminology. And it's real interesting because again in Enoch you don't have Jesus yet, but you have things like Son of Man, which are very prominent in the New Testament. And so for people who are, again, aware of the material, they can think, okay, versus Christians. Now I'll give you one little tidbit here. It's very common for New Testament critics to say that the idea of Jesus' pre-existence is late. Okay, like this is something that the early church came up with. We have the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. Like these are two different portraits, two different things. And of course, only the Jesus of history is the one that's real. All this Christology stuff is just made up by the early church. Well, guess what? The Book of Enoch's Messiah is pre-existent. What about that? So it has value again for making the point that a Jew listening to Jesus or reading one of the New Testament Gospels, where it gets into this pre-existence idea, a Jew's not going to hear that or read it and think, well, that's crazy. You're making something up now. That's not part of our messianic profile here. What's going on? No, instead they're going to go, yeah, okay, we've heard that before, and you're claiming that Jesus of Nazareth was pre-existent. In other words, it's a challenge to them, and it becomes part of the whole evangelism effort to get people to embrace. Yeah, this guy really was who he claimed to be.
Okay, well, so I'm going to ask you a question specifically about Revelation because, like I said, my head is in that. I'm about to write my chapter on Revelation.
That's if you don't know this, Michael. That's Heiser's least favorite book of the Bible to talk about.
Well,
he avoids it. He avoids it like the plague.
I'm going to reference one of your works.
So you think my answer is going to be don't read that?
Oh, man. So I'm actually going to reference one of your works, so you'll be familiar with this. This is in your book Demons. I read a while back, and you quote First Enoch 10:11-13 about the Watchers. Love for you to explain what those are, and how many scholars believe that the Book of Revelation describes their release, a precursor to the return of Christ, the day of the Lord, and their ultimate punishment with Satan in Revelation chapter 9, verses 1-10. So for those unfamiliar, that's the release of, most people believe these creatures to be demonic creatures, this sort of last days release of some sort of demonic beings. And so you're tying that to the book of First Enoch. Could you maybe just unpack that for us a little more?
Yeah. In all of the Jewish traditions about the events of Genesis 6:1-4. And again, it's a long road to understand how we can go from Genesis 6:1-4. And again, I'll loop in verse 5 here. Genesis 6:1-5, as it is in the Old Testament, to the Second Temple theology of, okay, these sons of God, they were supernatural beings. Enoch's favorite term for them is watchers, at least in the first 36 chapters. Chapters 37-71, he refers to them as angels, as, supernatural beings. But then, they do what they do, with human women, and they father the Nephilim, and you get these giant clans. And when you kill one of the Nephilim, the disembodied spirit, that's what a demon is. That's who Jesus encounters in the Gospels. And there's this whole full-blown theology. It's hard to know where they get that, but in the Demons book, I show you where the data points come from in the Old Testament and how they're putting them together for that. But one of the strands of that tradition that is not specifically mentioned in Genesis 6, but is part of the backstory that Genesis 6:1-5 is responding to, that is the Mesopotamian hollow story. One of the elements there is that the offending supernatural beings that violate the will of God or the gods, in Mesopotamia's case, in regard to the flood, they are sent back to the abyss. And they are sent, into the into the deep, into the abyss, into the pit. Okay, you get these various terms, and they are imprisoned until the end of days. Or in the Mesopotamian version, has something like that kind of talk. But in the Jewish traditions, it's always this until the end of days, the end of time, the end of, whatever, this eschatological endpoint. They're in jail, so to speak. They're the demons are spawn, and so on and so forth. We don't need to rabbit trail on that. But the supposition is, and I'm not unique here. I mean, this isn't just my view. This is a view that others have offered, that what's described in Revelation 9, I believe that's the chapter, the opening of the abyss. And correct me if I'm wrong here.
Yep.
What's described there is the opening of this prison, okay, and the release of these demonic powers, and specifically the ones that are said to be imprisoned. In other words, they're not allowed to leave, and so they must be released, are these guys. In Second Temple literature, if you asked a Jew living in the intertestamental period, hey, who do you think's getting let out there? 9 times out of 10, they're going to say, well, duh. Who's in jail? It's the Watchers. So it's this notion that they get out, and what do? Well, the reason, again, in intertestamental literature, that they're such a big deal is because they foment and accelerate and proliferate human self-destruction and depravity and idolatry. That's what they do. And so since we see these sorts of things emerge in the wake of what happens in Revelation 9, there are scholars who have suggested that this is probably the release because it's an apocalypse, it's the end of days. This is a precursor to the return of the Messiah, the whole day of the Lord stuff. And this is what it describes. They get out, and then they're gonna do what they do, and God's ultimately going to destroy them when the Messiah returns. But it's part of the very end timetable.
Excellent. I'd like to know, when understanding the book of Enoch, is it better to understand the book as prophetic literature or apocalyptic literature? And does taking it as one of those affect the way that we read it? If we take the book of Enoch
Yeah.
as prophetic, does that change the way that we read it if we were to read it apocalyptic?
When you say prophetic, do you mean as an end times system?
I mean,
don't know
like the
what word.
prophetic. I suppose the prophetic literature that I'm thinking of would be like the Old Testament prophets that are not
Okay, like
necessarily
warning. Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, I think, but I mean, it really does both. The you do get a sense if you read through Enoch. Yes, there are warnings. Yes, there are parts that tell the reader this is what's coming and it's going to be bad. There isn't a whole lot, though, that seems like they can do anything about it.
Right.
In other words, it's not an impetus to conversion. Again, it's pre-Jesus, so we don't get like an atonement sense attached to this. But it's also very deterministic. In other words, by the time Enoch tells you this information, it's going to be almost too late. This is going to come upon you, and Enoch wants you to know why you're going to end up where you're ending up. So there's less hope.
I'm losing you there. You said there's less hope, and then you said there's less hope, and then you kind of froze there for a second.
There's less hope in Enoch for the reader who is not followed than there is in the prophets. Enoch has a more deterministic feel to it. I don't know if I'm willing to say that's exclusive. There might be a passage or two that essentially sort of, I don't even know if I want to use the word encourages, but at least leaves the door open to repentance. But it has a real feel of finality to it. Like, we're letting you see this now because it's right around the corner. This is what's going to happen. Your fate is set. You made your bed, now you got to sleep in it. Just that sort of feel to it. So I think in that sense, it doesn't have a whole lot of prophetic value if we're talking about warning people. And so I would side with the apocalyptic idea. But in the New Testament, you get more encouragement because you look how the book opens. The book of Revelation, it's addressed to churches. The hope is that you'll endure to the end. You'll endure persecution. You'll stay in the faith. It's not so fatalistic.
It's a pastoral letter first. It's there to encourage the people, to get them through the situation. It's there for their exhortation and their encouragement, not for their, hey guys, buckle up, it's gonna suck.
Right. I just thought I would stop by and tell you you're doomed.
Yeah. Praise God.
Yeah, so speaking of being doomed, I want to come back to this subject of demons. I'm thinking about just the book of Enoch and how it might inform our angelology, our both good angels, bad angels. I'm thinking of Ephesians chapter 6, this multiplication of terms that the Apostle Paul uses in chapter 6, verse 12, the rulers, the authorities, the cosmic powers, this is the ESV, the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. And in the past, when I've read commentaries on these, it's scholars seem to just kind of be like, yeah, this might be this might be that, but really it's just kind of like all demons. But I'm curious, I know that you've really delved into this very deeply. And does the book of Enoch specifically inform our understanding of Paul's vocabulary?
Yeah, it does in places. Like, for instance, with rulers, and the very noteworthy passage, had 1 Corinthians 2, had the rulers of this world known, what the fallout would have been of killing the Messiah, they never would have crucified the Lord of glory, Paul says. Otherwise they'd be idiots, they had known. But a lot of commentators, like, and I love Fee's commentary, and he's certainly a good scholar. but he'll poo-poo the rulers there as supernatural agents, and he'll say things that really are not well defensible. That this term isn't used of supernatural being. Well, it is used of Enoch. It's the same term. It's also used of Septuagint Daniel, in the Theodosian text. I mean, it's used in other places too, where we have sinister, bad, supernatural beings that are called, archontes. It's just there, And so Enoch, again, provides an example or two to, basically resolve a question like that in 1 Corinthians 2. More broadly, though, the language, I think, Enoch is helpful at points, but I actually think there are other Second Temple books that are more helpful. And the reason I say that is because there are other books that are better for articulating, or at least referencing is the better word, referencing what I call the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. And I discuss all this at length in the Demons book, where you essentially three problems. You got the fall, you got the arch enemy, who becomes known as Satan, capital S Satan. You got him, and he brings forth death and estrangement from God. Then you get the Genesis 6 thing, and it's about depravity and idolatry and all this stuff. The Nephilim stuff is actually peripheral to the way a Second Temple Jew was thinking, because they live after the elimination of the Nephilim. They're not worried about Nephilim. They're worried about what the Watchers, taught people in terms of self-destruction and depravity and idolatry. That's the big deal there. And then you have this third group that emerges from Babel, circa Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9, and a few other passages in Deuteronomy. And these are the ones to whom are given geographical dominion as a judgment on the nations, the division of the nations at Babel, and God divorces himself from humanity and says, I'm going to start over. I'm going to pick this guy, Abraham. We'll see if this is any better than working with you people, because you just don't get it. After the flood, here we are again. You're still not obeying. So sayonara. But he makes a covenant with Abraham and says, I still want one of your seed to bless the nations. The nations are going to be brought back in and all that. But eventually, as we learn from Psalm 82, this doesn't work well. These supernatural agents, the sons of God in Deuteronomy 32:8, they sow chaos among the nations. This is where Daniel gets his theology. Like, nobody asked where Daniel gets this idea of Prince of Persia, Prince of Greece, supernatural entities over geopolitical empires. Where does he get that? Well, the only place you can get it is Deuteronomy 32. You just look back on your Old Testament. But by the time you get to Paul inherits worldview because he's the apostle to the Gentiles. He's the apostle to the nations. And this is why he uses terms like principalities, powers, rulers, thrones, dominions, all this stuff. They're all terms of geographical dominion, every one of them. And there are certain books like Jubilees and Ben Sira that specifically tap into this perspective and this worldview. Now, Enoch will do it. The animal apocalypse, the 70, shepherds, all this kind of stuff. There will be places in the book of Enoch where Enoch is dipping into and doing certain things with this idea. So it's helpful there. At least it shows you it was on the radar. But there are other books too that are really really useful.
A little better for it.
So what would be there's an accusation that I hear about the book of Enoch frequently in looking at this is so the kind of the mitigating position that I hear you saying is that this is going to inform the biblical authors when they write, and it's helpful to know what they were thinking about angelic beings and what they were thinking about the sons of God, and this helps gives context into the authors of the New Testament and how they are writing. But some have said, look, by doing that, what you're doing is you're saying that they are then pulling from a higher source. They're sourcing material that is authenticated, or they're sourcing material that they think is valid, and thus to disagree with portions of the book of Enoch, you're then disagreeing with the authorial intent of some of these New Testament books. And there's a confusion, I think, for a lot of Christians to go, man, it's how do we look at these New Testament authors saying, hey, if we're going to look at authorial intent, and they say, hey, these are accurate prophecies that we're going to pull from for us to then disagree with other sections of Enoch. So it places it in this like non-canonical limbo, but like super important because the apostles use it.
I think it's a manufactured. I think it's a manufactured limbo. I mean, you use the right word, confused. The fact that a New Testament writer would quote a source doesn't mean that he's articulating the idea that, oh, that source I just quoted is now the word of God. Otherwise, I wouldn't have quoted it. Again, it's a very circular, backwards, way of looking at things. Again, nobody says this about the Baal cycle. Okay, Psalm 74 takes stuff word for word out of the Baal cycle. The term Leviathan is right out of the Baal cycle.
Yep.
Okay, the wisdom of Amenemope is the backdrop for some of Solomon's proverbs. Solomon isn't thinking, well, since I'm using this material, I kind of like the way this guy writes, that now, this is going to be part of our sacred literature. Like there's a cosmic law that if I like this and use it, then that all of a sudden, cue the scary music, that now this is inspired. Again, it really reflects a deeply flawed view of inspiration.
I like that.
And that there's no quick curative, for that. But New and Old Testament writers use stuff all the time. Paul quotes Menander in 1 Corinthians 15. Oh, I guess Menander. The reason is they do it for very, very understandable reasons. Hey, if I use this is familiar to my audience. They're going to pick up what I'm laying down. They're going to get the point I'm trying to make because I'm taking something familiar in their head and I'm going to use it over here in this way or connect it to this other idea. And it's a teaching tool. It's like this is a dumb way of saying it. It's a word picture. It's a teaching tool.
We do that all the time in our sermons today, right? Like Michael will quote a movie when he's preaching for an illustration. He's not saying the movie's inspired. He's like the Holy Spirit like inspired Lord of the Rings, and like no, not going to happen.
Right. If Aragorn is a Christ figure, then Lord of the Rings must be inspired. What? Well, I guess the Chronicles of Narnia, they're inspired too because Aslan is a Christ figure.
Now, well, let's talk about.
I'm sure something like Kill Bill, doesn't have anything in there. It's a ridiculous way of thinking about the whole enterprise to make it more mundane. If I'm writing a book and I quote a book that I quote a scholar that helps me make my point. I don't think in my head, well, that guy's book is mine now. Right?
That would have been an interesting thought.
Michael's over there thinking about royalties. He's like, yes.
Let's all book quote Dan Brown now.
Yeah.
Of the thought process that when I dip into this, then this thing has the same status as the other thing. It is completely illogical, and it doesn't.
You're cutting out on us. Sorry.
Especially when the biblical writer to trash it.
Yeah.
I mean, they quote a lot of stuff or allude to a lot of stuff. Just that it's Yahweh, you dunderheads, not Marduk. Okay.
Yeah.
So, oops. Wait a minute. I just called that new inspired material garbage. Now what do I do? It just doesn't work. It's almost incomprehensible. But yet, I agree with you that that's a lot of people think that way about scripture. It's really unfortunate.
Yeah.
Dr. Heiser, what aspects of the book of First Enoch would fall outside the realm of Christian orthodoxy? Like, what actually goes against Christian doctrine? Is there some content in there like that?
There is. I mean, in the parables section, because of the nature of it with the judgment of Messiah, the righteous are consistently evaluated on the basis of their works. And again, we don't have you. Basically, you're not going to get trashed into oblivion and blown to bits in the apocalypse because you've rejected the Messiah. Again, there is no atoning Messiah in view, because this is pre-Jesus, all right? But rather the basis is you're not observing Torah. You're not loyal, to Yahweh and Torah and Jewish things. It's Jewish Torah, so this is what we would expect. And so the righteous are evaluated on their loyalty to the law, and the unrighteous are evaluated on their just general wickedness. Interestingly enough, Enoch does really focus a lot on what we would call social justice, the abuse of power by leaders, political leaders. Turns the crank for him in those chapters. He really goes off after that. And we know that the gospel is not based, in any of these things. But that's very clearly the perspective of Enoch, which without the revelation of Jesus, without his ministry and teaching, well, that's, what else would we expect, really?
Yeah.
Coming out of the exile is the thing. We have to be loyal to, because if we weren't, put us in exile. We don't want that to happen. So it's very understandable.
Yeah, that kind of pushes back against the new perspective, I think, maybe a little bit, but that's neither here nor there. We don't want to rabbit trail. This is my shameless plugs.
I don't think.
Yeah. While we're at it, Dr. Heiser, what do you think about the new perspective?
Yeah, don't do that.
No, I'm just kidding.
Well, I'll tell you just a little bit. On the one hand, I would agree with the new perspective that no clear thinking, there's the qualification.
Okay.
No clear thinking Jew is going to think, well, I deserve salvation because look how obedient I've been. A Jew who reads his Old Testament is going to know that he's not putting God in his debt. Okay? Yeah. But a lot of Jews didn't think clearly. It does become a performance-oriented thing. The law becomes about my track record. And so the paradox is, you can look at the Old Testament very clearly and know who God is, and that the only reason he's interested in having a relationship with you as a Jew is he made the covenant with you, and so on and so forth. And basically, your salvation is dependent on his mercy. He's never going to be in your debt. It's very easy to think that good thought and then sort of drift over into this, well, I'm really going to be ticked, if I don't get in because I've been pretty good. So I think they have the same kind of struggle there. So I think, the new perspective has a good theoretical point to make. But at the end of the day, if it's ruling out the fact that lots of Jews wouldn't have thought that precise, I think it's kind of missing something too.
Yeah. So with the when I was researching the kind of differences that we were seeing between the New Testament passages and what was written in the book of Enoch, one of the claims I came across was in Enoch 71 verses 13 and 14, that the Son of Man that has been prophesied in prior chapters was all of a sudden Enoch. That it was revealed that Enoch himself was this Son of Man that was going to come in judgment and glory, which would replace Enoch as the Messiah, as was what this claim was. Is that a right interpretation of Enochian literature as far as you're concerned, that Enoch is the Son of Man in Enoch chapter 71?
There would be scholars that would sort of read chapter 71 at, I don't want to be too, this is going to sound pejorative and I don't mean it to be, but they would read it so literalistically that that's the conclusion they would draw. Most Enochian scholars are not in that boat because it's so clear, even as recent as chapter 70, that the Son of Man and Enoch are different people. I mean, this is sprinkled all through the book. And then, so 71 becomes an aberration, which raises the question, what's up with that? And some people say, oh, this was added, or this was, some other hand, or blah. There's all sorts of explanations. Vanderkam and others would, I think, I don't want to call this a really, really good explanation, but I could see how it would work. Their view is that Enoch's experiences in the book are sort of real-time things he sees on the way to being transferred into the heavenlies. And then when you get to 71, all of a sudden, this is their interpretation. He has a different vision, or where he becomes a character in the scenes that he's been seeing, and his character happens to be the Son of Man. So it's not like all of a sudden, well, forget the first 70 chapters. We made boo-boos all over the place there, and now we've got the right track here. It's that Enoch is sort of, he becomes part of the story himself, and the mechanism, again, a lot of scholars think for that is either a dream, and there's certain language you can take in Enoch where it may be a dream state or something like that, but whatever it is, he all of a sudden becomes a character sort of experiencing firsthand as one of the players of the things he's seen. And the commentaries like Nicholsburg and Vanderkam and other work, that they'll come up with certain examples of other like transcendent scenes in other literature where this sort of thing happens, and saying, well, probably the same thing going on in Enoch here. The truth is that no one view has won the consensus for why this happens, but that's sort of at least an operative angle, to explain, other than just saying, oh, somebody just threw something in there that wasn't, original. Other than saying that, this is sort of an operative way of looking at it.
Yeah. Dr. Heiser, earlier you mentioned about the Watchers teaching people about idolatry. What does that even mean? What does it look like? Is that some, celestial being is like, hey, here's how to make a wooden idol, and they're kind of, wouldn't they already know that? Like what exactly is happening in this scene?
I don't think that they necessarily have to be taught the steps. Here's the recipe for idolatry. I think the point is that they either are influenced, if you want to use a word like seduced, or influenced or encouraged to not worship the God they should be worshiping. In other words, spiritual intelligence is lying to people about who they are, who the spiritual beings are, and who to attribute the good things in life to. It's not, Yahweh, it's over here. Who gives you power? Who gives you, fill in the blank, X, Y, Z? Who's keeping you alive? Who's keeping the enemies at your gates? All this sort of stuff. I think it's more or less, this is an overused phrase, but I'm going to use it. It's this battle for the mind, and if we as Christians are willing to assent, because the New Testament will say things like, don't fall prey to the wiles of the devil. The whole principalities and powers, the darts of the fiery darts of the wicked. The New Testament assents to this idea that spiritual forces do have an influence over the way we think and what we think. And so if that's the case, that I think is more in line with what's going on when it comes to encouraging people, nudging them
it's
along
less
toward disaster.
Is it less like a visitation and more like just kind of demonic spiritual influence that's working on them and they don't even recognize it?
Right. My view is the latter predominantly.
Okay.
And I'm willing to think that people, even like founders of other religions, we'll be as broad as we can here, have had visitations that have led to disastrous spiritual consequences.
Oh, yeah.
In other words, they'll create a faith, an alternative faith that either is a fairly reasonable counterfeit for the truth or something totally off the reservation. But I'm willing to believe that supernatural intelligences can do that because, again, if I were a supernatural power of darkness, I would work smart and not hard. I want an influencer. I want to influence the influencers, the ones that have power to move herds. How do I move herds? And I don't want to waste my day, even though I'm timeless and don't have to sleep, okay? But I don't want to waste my day having to move from person to person. That's boring. That's ridiculous. Let's see what we can do to find one person who can move thousands and hundreds of thousands or millions and can trap them in a false belief so that Yahweh is robbed of his children. Sounds pretty good. Let's do that. How can we work smart and not hard? And that's how I would do it. And I think there is something to be said for intelligence being behind, certain episodes in the history of religion, just generally, that has led to millions being blinded to the gospel.
Excellent. Well, let's do this. We're at the portion of our show where we try to do a closing thought, where we just kind of, for the audience that's out there, whether it be resources, materials, just some real quick thoughts where we can say, we want you to walk away thinking about this if you haven't about the Book of Enoch. I'll start with Michael Roundtree, and then we'll toss it over to Dr. Heiser and get your closing thoughts before we wrap up the program. Roundtree, what are your thoughts, man?
Yeah. I'm just fascinated by what you were saying, Dr. Heiser, about Enoch's solution to explaining the problem of evil. And I do see this in the New Testament as well, but just this idea that it's not just that people went mentally insane and do deranged things. There really are demonic powers behind the scenes. I think that Christians actually have an edge on this in explaining how evil can be so evil, because it's like people will do things like torture infants. They'll do things that are so mind-blowingly abominable, and you're just like, how could anyone even? Well, we actually do have an explanation for it, and so I just think that's just like a really great just sort of thing that Christianity offers that the secular world really doesn't offer. The secular world just says, well, it's mental illness. And I'm just like, that doesn't really do it for me. So it's just kind of a thought, but that's kind of what struck me.
Dr. Heiser, your thoughts, sir?
Yeah, that's actually a very good negative example of something that came up on a podcast episode of mine fairly recently. I interviewed a guy named Michael Jahosky, who is a humanities professor here in Florida, and the whole discussion was about Tolkien. He has a book out called The Good News of the Return of the King, and it's about how Tolkien communicated the gospel through his writings, and his argument is that the Lord of the Rings is essentially one grand parable that hooks into the parables of Jesus to talk about the same things. And he makes the comment in the book that the problem.
Oh no! Sorry, Dr. Heiser. You said the problem is the problem of the book that you cut out.
The problem with materialistic approaches to reality is that science corresponds to reality, but the reality is that isn't true. It doesn't answer every question, and it doesn't even provide the best explanation for different things. What you need is again, the myth. Okay, myth just being an overarching story where supernatural characters like God are legitimately a part of the story. They're real, and they're in the fabric of unfolding reality. And he uses this line that a view of life that excludes the mythic, again, the spiritual, if you will, is less real, and the other one is more real. I mean, we wouldn't think of using words like more or less real. It's either real or not. Well, actually, no, it isn't. Science only takes you part of the way. It leaves things out. And the other side, the spiritual side, puts the things in that are missing. And so you must have it to have the fullest understanding of what is real. You have to have it, because without it, it's incomplete. And so you've taken that idea and actually given the negative example of it. You really can't explain evil just through brain chemistry, or this or that condition, or this or that trauma someone's experienced. Okay, you can explain a number of things through those vehicles, but it never is quite satisfying.
That's right.
There is evil that transcends, if that's the right word, that
Oh yeah.
transcends those things in terms of badness.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to have something else to fill in the gaps in an explanatory way. So
No,
I think you're right.
I think your material
Dr.
has
Heiser says
helped.
I'm right, Josh.
Yeah,
Dr.
we'll
Heiser says
put it.
I'm right.
We'll put it down on the scoreboard.
Go ahead and put that. Yeah.
With the one other theologian
Josh,
who also said that.
Josh, has he mentioned that to you today?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and watch it. So Michael, I just want you to stop.
Right there.
Yeah, Michael is only on this podcast right now because he's trying to get free commentary on his book that he's writing, and he's just trying to ask Dr. Heiser questions so he can source him in the book.
You're saying I'm contributing to his descent into madness?
Yeah. So he's going to put it on the cover of his book. Dr. Heiser says, "That's right, Michael." Like Dr. Heiser. I think that's it. That's going to be the cover of the book.
It's going to be the endorsement.
So I was just going to say that this has been. It's really fascinating how theology like this has really impacted my apologetic in witnessing with people who are polytheists, like your work on the divine council and how there's these geographical spirits that are kind of ruling over regions, and the way that we combat that was with the gospel. And then I witnessed with people who are from kind of an Indian background from India, and they have this very vast polytheistic system. And I've met people who are like, yeah, I have to keep sacrificing to my demon god or it'll kill me. And I go, I actually have an answer for that. Like I'm not actually saying, because most Christians would enter into that conversation saying you're delusional, you're crazy. Right. But I'm entering into that conversation going, no. I understand how this worldview system works, and my God created that angel. He created that falling being who's ruling and reigning over your region, and my Christ can set you free and at liberty of that. I had a guy recently who's over my house, and we were talking about psychedelics and some of the uniform experiences that he has had, and he's an agnostic guy. Great conversations, and he's like, man, these psychedelics, we talked about DMT and some of these other kind of psychedelics where there's uniform experiences, very spiritual experiences. And my response to that as a Christian is go, oh yeah, there's tons of spiritual experiences. There's tons of powers and forces that can lead you and guide you in these kinds of existential experiences. So I'm not saying that they're not real, but I am saying that they're not good, right? And I'm able to enter into that space and not deny these very authentic supernatural experiences people are having, but then answer it with an authentic gospel presentation that is very spiritual in the midst of that. And I think it's a very helpful apologetic. Anyway, want to wrap up.
It's also part of again, if you want to call it the Watcher worldview, because
absolutely
of teaching people to use roots and herbs and stuff like it. It's pharmac. I mean, Paul uses that term in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. In association with demons and idolatry. What's to produce altered states? I mean, it's right there. It is. Boom. Where else do you find that?
Yeah.
That would be Enoch.
That would be Enoch. That's Enochian. So, guys, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Remnant Radio. If you're not familiar, Dr. Heiser's come on quite a few times before and done episodes with us. I'd encourage you to go back into the archive and find those videos. We've got one on theosis. We've got one on the unseen realm. I think we've got one on demons. We've got quite a bit of content that we have produced with Dr. Heiser. So lots of good content. You can go back in the archives and watch. Really, really interesting stuff. But man, if you're also new to the channel, we've interviewed guys like N.T. Wright, Wayne Grudem, Craig Keener, Jack Deere, Sam Storms. The list goes on and on theologically in those spaces. We're about to interview Francis Chan next week, and we've interviewed Todd White. Talk about an eclectic island of misfit toys. We've got them all here on the channel, so make sure to subscribe, and we're going to have content coming out like this all the time. And I would encourage you, if you're blessed by the content, a couple ways you can help support the channel. You can give on PayPal, one-time gift there. Helps us produce this content, or you can give on Patreon. You get a little bit of extra kickback from us, special content, our commentary on episodes like this. Me and Michael will probably film in a week or two. We'll talk about, hey, this is what our thoughts were on this video that we filmed. Here's our thoughts on our interview with Francis Chan or Todd White or those kinds of things. Most of our interviews are neutral. We don't kind of give you our opinion, but in these spaces, we're able to share that a little bit more. Also, I want want to remind you, if you're out there and you're like, hey, I can't afford $5 a month, I totally get it. Let me know. Shoot me an email at media@TheRemnantRadio, and I can send you any video that you're not able to get access to. We don't want to make there some kind of paywall for those who can't afford it. So anyway, that's it for us today. I want to thank everyone for tuning in once again, and we'll see you tomorrow at 4 p.m. Central Time. I think on the way out we'll listen to some new Remnant Radio music that we're thinking about incorporating into our setup here. Let's see if we got it queued. Yeah. Anyway, blessings, guys. We'll see you later.